Environmental Psychology, Relational Summary for Chapter 1. Let's dive into our environmental psychology textbook, shall we? What I'm doing here is giving you my relational summary of the first chapter, a chapter we'd like us all to read and take a stab at summarizing so that we can see what we each take away from this general overview of the field, before we plunge into the more substantive content chapters, which each one of you will take on as a personal mission to summarize and relate to and make known to the other students. But with this exercise, we can see how each of us interpreted and related to a chapter that we all read, and how we connect to it in common. The way I see it, the introduction to our text reveals that the book is structured into three main parts, which make three essential main points. Part 1 focuses on the environmental impacts on, quote, human health and well-being, exploring the, quote, negative as well as positive influences of environmental conditions on humans. It tells us that, quote, key topics include risk perception, environmental stressors, nature experience, health effects of nature, architecture, urban environmental quality, and quality of life effects on environmental conditions, end quote. In addition, say the authors, in the second edition, 2 new chapters have been added addressing the topics of climate change risks and the importance of nature for children. Now that was important for me to learn and was one of the chief reasons I selected this particular textbook for our class. Since I have 2 young children who have to deal with the tragedy of the Earth's sixth mass extinction and are watching nature disappear around them, and because I am the director of the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Program at the University of South Florida and teach courses that deal with the psychology of climate skepticism and denial, I felt that any course, curriculum, or textbook in environmental psychology that didn't address climate change risks and the importance of nature for children would not be doing us any favors and would actually be a terrible disservice, derailing us from devoting time to some of the most important issues in human history. How's that for a strong opinion and rationale? And that's the essence of a relational summary. As you summarize the chapters of the book, please get emotionally involved, react, relate. The book is meant to prod us and provoke us and invite our participation in solving real, world, and very relevant issues. And that leads us to part 2 of the book, which is another reason I like this book and chose it for our course. Part 2 focuses on, quote, pro-environmental behavior, exploring the, quote, factors that influence human behavior that affect environmental quality, end quote. See, in this course, you're asked to get involved. Use your knowledge to be a truly productive pro, not anti-environmental member of society at a critical time in our evolutionary history when we actually have the power to either fix our mistakes and the messes we created or drive ourselves and most of the other charismatic megafauna that we love so much extinct. You've heard the joke, don't just do something, stand there. Well, we want you to do the opposite. So this book is good in that it offers, quote, various ways to measure environmental behavior. Factors influencing this behavior, such as norms and values, are discussed. And we want to hear about your values regarding your environments. What are the norms you follow? That is, what do you consider or want to be normal when it comes to your environments and your behavior? How do you feel about it? Specifically, in this second edition, says our book, quote, the newly added chapter 19 is dedicated to the significant role that emotions can play in people's engagement in pro-environmental behavior, while chapter 20 discusses symbolic aspects of environmental behavior. Furthermore, newly added chapter 23 reviews how group memberships and the group processes associated with these memberships can affect environmental behavior, end quote. We really want you to explore how the in-groups and the out-groups you belong to are affecting your relationship to your shared and individual environments, and how you think about your behavior. We all know, for example, that many men say they aren't interested in helping the environment because it doesn't feel manly to show concern about nature. Such men will more likely talk about hunting or killing in nature as a positive thing when they're in a group of other men, but can sometimes reveal a more gentle side when they're alone or in the presence of a group of women. These group dynamics are part of our course, and I'm glad the book discusses them. The introduction goes on to say, quote, "The chapters in Part 2 present different theories to explain environmental behavior, among which are norm theory, value theory, theories on effect, social dilemma theory, social identity theory, the theory of planned behavior, the norm activation theory, the value belief in norm theory of environmentalism, and habit theory," end quote. So if you've been studying these theories in other psychology or social science classes, now's the time to apply your knowledge to saving the world. Ain't that fun? Part 3 focuses on factors that affect the outcomes and acceptability of strategies to encourage pro-environmental behavior for creating sustainable environments. That's Steg, page 5. This again can go back to perceptions of gender roles, social class, political affiliation. I mean, do Trump supporters feel it's unacceptable to think about future generations or the protection of wildlife and wilderness areas? Our book talks about, quote, "ways to encourage pro-environmental behavior and well-being via informational strategies, changing the incentives and technological innovations." It also discusses factors influencing the acceptability of policies, processes of change, and social simulation of behavior changes. Besides, special attention is paid to encouraging pro-environmental actions in developing countries, end quote. So in this sense, the book is very proactive and broad in its scope, considering environmental psychology to be a kind of roadmap in how we might better affect and react to the effects of our environments. The chapter talks a bit about the origin and history of our field of study. And while I'm not so interested in committing to memory the names and dates associated with this science, I find it fascinating that from its early origins in the studies of Helpach way back in 1911, environmental psychology seems to have always been about much more than what the public today often thinks about the environment. You know, many people outside of scholarly settings hear environmental and think of it as something related purely to wilderness and possibly vacation spots. However, and this is important to understand, environmental in our branch of psychology really means what I talked about in our introduction lecture, that which surrounds us. And that means everything. Helpach in 1911 saw environmental psychology as looking at the impact of, quote, different environmental stimuli such as color and form and the sun and the moon and extreme environments on human activities. And in his later work, he also studied urban phenomena such as crowding and overstimulation, and distinguished different types of environments in his work, including natural, social, and historical cultural environments. That's Poll 2006, quoted in Steg 2019. Now this is consistent with what I addressed in my relational summary introduction, where I made a lot of fuss about there being no such thing as the environment, but rather there being many, many different types of environments, social, physical, psychological, whatever surrounds us and affects our bodies, our moods, and our minds. But ironically, the idea that environmental thinking should go beyond our own navel staring and preoccupation with our personal lives and extend to the entire Earth's envelope is actually what is new. And that makes sense, doesn't it, from what we know about human psychology? Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you no doubt studied in other classes. Now, Maslow suggested that children pass through a more or less linear hierarchy of needs, starting with the physiological demands of a baby: nourishment, management of digestive byproducts, and physical comfort, temperature regulation, on up to meeting safety concerns, and then finding a sense of belonging and love through which feelings of self-esteem develop and become important. And the assumption was that only then did people have the mental and emotional bandwidth to attend to the higher goals of self-actualization. The hierarchy suggested that ever-widening circles of environmental concern could only be accommodated by people once they had dealt with their most immediate needs. Wah. When I think back to the first Earth Day in 1970, when I was 8 years old and trying to organize kids in my neighborhood to care about the wildlife and water quality in the Mercy College woods, I felt a lot of frustration learning how few of my schoolmates had any concern at all about things outside their immediate social surroundings. Now, they cared about sports and peers and getting ice cream from the Good Humor truck, yeah. And the older kids cared about playing pranks and going to parties and getting girls. So I asked my mother, who taught psychology at Mercy College, why I felt so unusual being a kid who was interested in environmental issues. And she replied, in our courses that we teach at Mercy College, she replied, in our courses at Mercy, we teach about Maslow, and he has shown that until our basic needs are met, people can't think about larger issues. The problem, and I realized it even then at the tender age of 8, is that this is a complete misinterpretation of Maslow's 1943 psychological review paper in which he proposed his theory of human motivation. See, Maslow himself realized the limitations of his approach when he later extended the theory to include his observations of humans' innate curiosity. That's a quote from Wikipedia. Children are born curious. Maslow saw that, and as soon as they're crawling, they start expanding the borders of their environments. This is not only true of humans. The classic sociobiology textbook, Baboon Mothers and Infants by Gene Altman, describes how quickly monkeys enlarge their environmental awareness, starting out venturing only within the narrow radius of their mother's reach, really because she will grab them by the ankle and drag them back to her chest if they try to go any further. But gradually, as they wean, making their way farther and farther away, driven by innate curiosity, until their circle includes the dangerous treetops and hills and crevices outside of their mother's sight and embrace. And this is true about all animals, isn't it? Our environmental interests and concerns grow as we grow, unless they are stopped. The problem with Maslow's original hierarchy is that our society deliberately stunts the growth of children's curiosity, constrains our choices and awareness, and mislabels the actual needs that we have and how they map on to our environments. Now let me explain what I mean by that. By the age of 8, by 3rd grade, on the first Earth Day, I and all my peers had already passed through the first 4 supposed stages of Maslow. By 8, my physiological needs were all met. I knew enough about how to stay safe, crossing the street without holding hands and without the crossing guard. I didn't need the school bus to take me from Draper Lane to Springhurst Elementary, but was already walking the half hour to school and home with some of my friends each day. I knew how to play safely in the creek, in the woods, and down at the Mercy College beach by the Hudson without drowning or getting hurt. I felt a strong sense of belonging to my neighborhood, my school, and of course my family. And I felt loved, and I felt I knew how to love my family and friends and teachers. My self-esteem was good. I was performing in the school plays and choir, and I was great at organizing kids to play Ringalario and hide and seek out back. So I, like most human beings, was already long into my self-actualization phase. And that's because our innate curiosity that Maslow talked about had helped me satisfy my other needs long before. Remember that most mammals are already adults by the age of 8. We humans are a little slower, but by the age of 13, our ancestors were having families of their own. The extended adolescence of modern humans, I quickly learned, is a product of the industrial age schooling system and was intended to keep young people retarded so that they would not compete with adults in the workforce. Hence, a lot of busy work was forced upon children from 8 to 18, while we were kept in a kind of holding tank called school. And in that holding tank, most of the real environmental concerns that should have interested us were held as special knowledge only for the very few who were encouraged to develop an interest and maintain an interest in science. The rest of the children were supposed to grow up to be good consumers and docile workers who obeyed authority. To do this, our basic needs had to be distorted, so they were never really met. By feeding us junk food filled with naked calories, refined starches and carbohydrates and sugars, we stayed perpetually hungry and addicted and insecure. And by constantly being forced to compete with our peers in age-graded classrooms and sports and performance activities, we spent decades feeling insecure about love and belonging. Our curiosity was tightly controlled so that we became more concerned about pleasing authorities with the right answer and passing exams than following our instincts towards self-actualization and leading a meaningful life. As a result, most of us never really grow up. Because of this, corporations and government agents seeking to make huge profits through the creation of environmental injustices and negative externalities are able to keep us from any enduring interest in improving our environments. An obsession with the individual, with the self, and our selfish needs kept us on the lowest rungs of Maslow's hierarchy. The problem is that in reality, If we were only concerned about our physiological and safety needs, our concerns would really be overtly environmental, since the greatest threats to us come from disturbed environments, and our greatest needs for food and shelter can only come from healthy environments. Hence, people fixated in the most immediate needs identified by Maslow should be the most interested in environmental psychology, while those interested in actualization should be the ones thinking of going to the movies or parties or playing games and sports, indulging in the arts and hedonistic pleasures. Yet somehow we are told that environmental concerns are luxuries. Our textbook tells us that early on in the environmental psychology movement, theorists were the ones trying to break us out of the stalemate that comes from obsessive attention to our personal needs and helping us to see the connections with the larger realities facing and impacting us. Brunswick, back when, argued, for example, that psychology should, quote, give as much attention to the properties of the organism's environment as it does to the organism itself. He strongly advocated research that includes all aspects of the environment of the person we are trying to understand, rather, quote, than the fragmented and artificial environments that were more typical in psychological studies of the day, end quote. Lewin argued that research should be driven by real-world social problems, using a, quote, non-reductionist, problem-focused approach that applies theories in practice, end quote. Lewin conceptualized the environment as a key determinant of our behavior. He argued that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. That's Lewin, 1951. And he focused mostly on the social and interpersonal influences instead of the physical environment. As is typical with recognized fields of study, there's usually some economic or political incentive that makes it enter the wider school curricula. It appears that the birth of the official field of environmental psychology as an academic field for you and I to study came about as part of the post-World War II housing boom phenomenon, where architects and planners were exploring, quote, the best way to get workers in new housing developments to perform better in their jobs by providing shelters that had the necessary comforts from the built environment. It wasn't concerned with the larger existential questions of human physiology, health, and safety, but more about commercial commodities that could be bought and sold and drive the capitalist economy. Housing stock and city environments were related to profits. The life support systems and ecosystems of planet Earth were considered irrelevant and inconvenient, particularly as business and government were using them as low-cost dumping grounds for production residuals and the pollution that business created but didn't want to pay for. Steg tells us, quote, questions like how homes, offices, or hospitals could be best built for the potential users and how environmental stressors, by which she meant extreme temperatures, humidity, and crowding, would affect human performance and well-being, those were the focus of many environmental psychological studies. Volville, 1970. Environmental psychology as a study to design buildings that would facilitate behavioral functions was officially born, end quote. It was considered more of an architectural psychology than a psychology of how nature influences us or how we influence nature. When I was a child in the 1960s, environmental pollution and habitat loss were becoming so bad that they spawned a resistance movement that led to the formation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in the early 1970s, and the launching of the first Earth Day that year, where we as citizens began to work on ways we could improve our immediate environments and, as a nation, tackle the problems facing us all in bigger environments. In my case, as I've mentioned, I have a strong memory of organizing the kids at Draper Lane in Dobbs Ferry to help clean up the Mercy College woods that was my playground in Dobbs Ferry. And the adults simply satisfied themselves by planting flowers and removing trash from the front of the building. It was at this moment, at the age of 8, that I truly saw how different my perceptions of environmental awareness differed from others. But the point of the book is that during that period, the definition of what environmental psychology deals with broadened to include, quote, air pollution, to Groot 1967, Lindvall 1970, urban noise, Griffiths and Langdon 1968, and the appraisal of environmental quality, Appleyard and Craik 1974, Craik and McCheney 1974. Widening to include, quote, issues of energy supply and demand, Zubedal 1975, and risk perceptions and risk assessment associated with energy technologies, that's Fishoff et al. 1978. So that by the 1980s, quote, the first studies were conducted that focused on efforts promoting conservation behavior, including, quote, relationships between consumer attitudes and behavior, Cohn and Hayes 1980, Stern and Gardner 1981, Steg 2019, page 4. Naturally, as the challenges of sustainability have become better appreciated, the field of environmental psychology has widened even further. Eventually, nobody could ignore how the degradation of our environments was affecting the lowest levels of our Maslowian hierarchy. Today, environmental psychology urgently deals with the seemingly overwhelming and, sadly, exceptionally here in the US, hotly debated challenges of climate change and deforestation, which we see occurring at an unprecedented rate in the Brazilian Amazon right now. And there's a link here for a quote on how anthropogenic or human-caused fires are threatening our global health, economic prospects, and food and water supply. That's the IPCC 2013, with a recognition that the chief causes for these dire phenomena are anthropogenic, human-induced. What is changing in environmental psychology today, according to our book's authors, is this greater emphasis on, quote, finding ways to change people's behavior to reverse environmental problems, while at the same time preserving human well-being and quality of life, end quote. The concepts of sustainability, adopted by the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1987, with its balanced emphasis on, quote, the three main pillars of sustainable development, which include economic growth, environmental protection, and social equality, Steg 2019, page 4. This psychology of sustainability comprises four key features according to our book: a focus on human-environment interactions, an interdisciplinary approach, an applied focus, and a diversity of methods. The authors have several really good quotes that I think are worth reiterating, and here I've chosen three that stand out. One, humans and the environment are related in a reciprocal, dynamic way. Two, the presence of nature in the environment of childhood may influence people's connectedness to nature and willingness to support nature conservation. So childhood is critical. And three, in turn, people's support for nature conservation measures may influence environmental conditions such as biodiversity. They give the example of how historical legacy and the already built environment radically affect how much choice we have over environmental alternatives, showing that often it isn't necessarily a lack of concern for wider environments that makes us destroy our ecosystems and life support systems, but lack of realistic options. For example, Steg says, quote, the available infrastructure for public and private transport may influence the level of car use, while in turn the level of car use may influence the seriousness of environmental problems such as air pollution and global warming, end quote. Perhaps our field of study suggests it isn't that people don't care about their environments, but that we really haven't been given many options, to say nothing of the horrible education we've suffered from that keeps us in our silos, unable to think outside the boxes, the mental prisons that we're trapped in. Reflecting on that, Steg talks about how vital it is that environmental psychology is truly interdisciplinary. She writes about how our field crosses at least three domains. She says, first, environmental psychology has always worked closely with the disciplines of architecture and geography to ensure a correct representation of the physical spatial components of human environmental relationships. See part 1 of this book. Second, theoretical and methodological development in environmental psychology has been influenced strongly by social and cognitive psychology. See part 2 of this book. Third, when studying and encouraging pro-environmental behavior, see part 3 of this book, environmental psychologists have collaborated with environmental scientists, among others, to correctly assess the environmental impact of different behaviors, end quote. Because the stakes are high and resolution of our challenges urgent, environmental psychology now uses a problem-focused approach so that we who study it can, quote, contribute towards solving real-life problems, identifying the most effective solutions to real-life problems, end quote. We don't choose between theory and practice. Instead of engaging in primitive modernist either-or thinking that accompanies political agendas that are bent on dumbifying us, to use Yale professor James Scott's words. Using phrases like, "You're either with us or against us," and seeing the world in black or white, left or right. We use postmodernism's thinking. It's a both-and thinking. As our dean at the UCLA School of Urban Planning and Social Policy told us when I became a graduate student there, in her welcoming address, quote, "Here we combine theory and practice on a daily basis into praxis," which the dictionary defines as both the practical application of a theory and the exercise or practice of an art, science, or skill, or a customary practice or conduct. Our goal as environmental psychologists is indeed to make the best practices in environmental sustainability customary conduct, the normal way we behave, instead of the exception. You heard the phrase, think globally, act locally? Many of us in our field have also questioned that as imperialist thinking and flipped the statement around saying, the earth is so big, it's really hard for people to think globally. It's my belief that we actually have no business thinking globally. It reeks of hubris from our hegemonic colonialist past. It smacks of empire building. Instead, I flip the statement around and say we should think locally and thereby act globally, by which I mean that once we've solved our problems at the local scale and then shared our solutions and implementations in our own homes, our own communities, and our own lives, Maslow, our psychology should be positively affected such that other people decide also to implement those practices in their neighborhoods of their own free will. And this has a global ripple effect so that we end up acting globally. However, in the age of geographical information systems, or GIS, and geographical positioning satellites, or GPS, and Google Maps and Google Earth, I do find it valuable to get a global perspective. So if that is a form of thinking globally, having expanded worldview whenever we consider the impact of our local actions, that's also okay. The point is that we have to increase our awareness and make sure we discuss all of these things with the stakeholders involved. Environmental psychology accommodates this constant changing in perspective by operating continuously, as Steg points out on page 6, at, quote, different scale levels from domestic surroundings and the neighborhood to cities, nature reserves, and countries, and even the planet as a whole. Environmental psychology is concerned with problems at all scales, from local to global, end quote. Environmental psychology also uses a wide diversity of methods. Our book emphasizes that it uses both quantitative and qualitative methods, like all branches of psychology, of course. But because it is dealing with impacts that can have a great effect on human and non-human populations, it strives for a mix of methods that maximize both the internal and the external validity, so that the trade-offs don't end up hurting anybody or system. As Steg points out on page 6, quote, internal validity reflects the extent to which cause-effect relationships can be established. External validity reflects the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to other populations or settings, end quote. But we must be very careful about our notions of how valid generalizations really are and when they should be applied. It is this generalization that caused problems in the past with trying to think globally. The Yale professor James C. Scott I mentioned in his classic Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed, in the final chapter, quote, explores two types of knowledge that need to be mixed if we are to improve our environmental conditions and societies. Metis, or practical knowledge, and techne, or technical knowledge. I give a reference here for a blog about this that will help you understand them. There's a big practical difference between metis and techne, which gets at the heart of our schooling problems and our development problems. Scott describes metis as something that, quote, resists simplification into deductive principles, which can successfully be transmitted through book learning, because the environments in which metis is exercised are so complex and non-repeatable that formal procedures of rational decision-making are impossible to apply. In a sense, he says, metis lies in that large space between the realm of genius, to which no formula can apply, and the realm of codified knowledge, which can be learned by rote. Metis is most valuable in settings that are mutable, indeterminate, some facts are unknown, and particular. That's Scott 1999, page 316. And you can see how metis allows us to apply local knowledge and gains its internal validity when it works in very specific situations, but suffers from the external validity problem in that it cannot easily be generalized to other settings or people. There is no one-size-fits-all with métis. Like local cuisine and farmers' markets, it requires a deep understanding of particular places and cultures. You can't make a McDonald's-like franchise with métis. On the other hand, we have technique, which Scott defines as settled knowledge that has been universalized into theory. He says, quote, "The universality of technique arises from the fact that it is organized analytically into small, explicit, logical steps and is both decomposable and verifiable. This universality means that knowledge in the form of technique can be taught more or less completely as a formal discipline. The rules of technique provide for theoretical knowledge that may or may not have practical applications. Finally, technique is characterized by impersonal, often quantitative precision and a concern with explanation and verification, whereas métis is concerned with personal skill or touch and practical results." End quote. Scott 199, page 320. 1999, page 20. Now, most of our environmental problems seem to be the result of misapplications of technique. One government decides to build huge dams for hydropower, and suddenly all governments want to build the same kind of dam in their country, regardless of the impact on the watershed, the forests, or the local people. They can be damned. One country starts building nuclear power plants, struggling to make them safe, like France. Another country with a different environment, like Japan, builds identical power plants, only to find, to their regret and horror, that the zone they're building in, unlike France, suffers from earthquakes and tsunamis that make the technique irresponsibly dangerous. But meanwhile, being blessed with extreme amounts of local wind and wave power and geothermal potential, from the very forces that create the earthquakes, Japan could be powering its entire country with clean renewable energy. But it chose to ignore the métis and focus on the Western technique. See, the problem is that we have a global school system now that privileges certain kinds of knowledge, mostly Western knowledge, and spreads it weed-like around the world without much deep critical thinking or reflection. It's relatively easy to teach technique, but very hard to teach métis. Technique follows general rules of thumb and can be learned from a cookbook or by doing simple exercises at school, while métis usually needs years of apprenticeship with a master chef. The thing about changing the world with what you learn in theory classes in school is that when you get out into the world, particularly when dealing with different populations and environments from the one the theory was developed for, technique often fails miserably. Each local environment has to provide its own external validity check. As Steg says on page 6, quote, "Low external validity or the finding may be problematic if the goal is designing an intervention to solve a specific applied problem. However, it may be less relevant if the purpose of the research is testing theory, because in this case the main concern is to achieve a high internal validity. Businesses and governments that want to make profits or gain power, and want to do it quickly, care less about external validity than they do internal validity. However, both are really important. The job of a good student of environmental psychology like you is not to choose one over the other, but is to know when and how to apply both technique and métis to gain the appropriate level, and that is what the subtle mix of praxis is all about. Chapter 1 of our book shows us that the methods we use to get at knowledge in environmental psychology research reflect the trade-offs between internal and external validity. Questionnaire studies, laboratory experiments, simulation studies, field studies, and case studies are the most common and are illustrated in Table 1.1 on page 7. Some can be used independent of specific environmental settings, some only in artificial settings, while others lend themselves better to real settings. Here on this table are their strengths and weaknesses. Questionnaires, problem, causality cannot be established, which weakens internal validity. Does the municipality decide to place garbage bins because people tend to litter a lot in certain areas, or do people litter because there are no bins available? How would you know? So laboratory experiments are done, and laboratory experiments, quote, enable the establishment of causal relationships between variables because of two basic features of experiments: manipulation and random assignment. Laboratory experiments produce great technique, but applying that knowledge to the real world is very difficult. And we have computer simulations these days that try to address this by including as many variables from the real world into the model as possible, and then manipulating them to get a broader understanding of cause and effect. And the more realistic the model, the more generalizable it is, while at the same time, by running nuanced simulations, one can begin to develop some external validity and actually some métis in virtual reality. The best way to do experiments that provide a reasonable balance between external and internal validity is to get out into the real world and do real-world field studies. The problem with field studies is there's little experimental control in the real world, and gathering data is very time-consuming. Finally, one can use case studies, which give great insights into métis-dominated situations. A focus on single individuals or group perceptions and histories on a case-by-case basis can be done, but the problem with that is its internal validity is low. The qualitative analysis makes great just-so stories that can be emotive and impactful, but then it's hard to generalize and apply successfully to other situations. Let's face it, there's no single right approach or right answer in environmental psychology. What makes our field so exciting is that as you study it and practice it, you become a scientist and an artist at the same time, using your entire mind and body and soul to solve problems that are vitally important to you and to everyone and everything you know and love. Environmental psychology is as narrow or as wide as you would like it to be, and that's because everything and everybody is an environment, and therefore worth thinking about. We can't wait to hear your thoughts about this first chapter of the book that guides our journey and all the great chapters to follow. Welcome aboard.